Well, good morning, everyone. We still may have a few people dialing in, but we want to try to get started on time. So thank you very much for joining me today for this webinar on anti-corruption third-party due diligence. My name is Leslie Benton. I am a Vice President at the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade. I was to be joined today by my colleague Craig Moss, our COO, but he had an unexpected issue arise, so he will not be able to join today, so I will go forward without him. The Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, or CREATE.org, is a global NGO. We focus on anti-corruption and intellectual property protection, and in particular sharing leading practices from companies, think tanks, academics, and others who are working on these two huge issues for companies. And of course, chief among those is the risk that third parties pose from an anti-corruption perspective and how companies can address that risk through effective due diligence, and that's what we'll be speaking about today. We have a brief agenda. We thought we'd start out with a little context setting and talk a little bit about the global problem that corruption poses for companies. Give a little bit, just a very brief overview of the laws in this area, and then move really quickly into talking about third parties as a key risk and how to use due diligence to address that risk. So with that, I think I'll just go ahead and get started with our brief overview. We know that for companies doing business really anywhere today, corruption is a very real and all too common problem. In the United States, we see enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the Fcpa, continuing at a very aggressive pace. And here on this slide, you see just a few of the more recent settlement agreements with companies. But the U.S. certainly is not alone any longer in these efforts. According to the Transparency International report on enforcement by OECD countries, Germany and Switzerland are both actively enforcing their anti-bribery laws. And we're starting to see enforcement from other quarters as well. Certainly the UK, Italy, and other countries are beginning to enforce their laws. In addition to that, we see the landscape in China and Brazil improving from an anti-corruption perspective with a new focus on enforcement in China and a tough new law in place in Brazil. And of course, everybody's very aware of the Petrobras investigation that's going forward in Brazil right now. Again, just showing that sort of the effort and energy behind these enforcement efforts really all over the globe. And I wanted to mention, though, in addition to governments, one of the things that we're seeing is the rising enforcement efforts by the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and so on. They primarily operate in emerging markets, but they're now routinely conducting anti-corruption investigations of bank-funded projects with really far-reaching consequences for companies, including debarment from bank work, but also referral to country enforcement authorities. And certainly in the U.S., we have seen some cases referred by the World Bank that have been taken up by the Justice Department and have resulted in significant DPAs. External demand for compliance is coming from other quarters as well. Investors are now demanding information about a company's commitment to corruption prevention. We've seen the European Union recently adopt a directive requiring companies to disclose information on their anti-corruption efforts. And in this environment, it's just essential for companies to ensure that they understand and can effectively address their corruption risks. And I just want to spend a minute there talking about the fact that the risks go beyond just the sort of legal and attendant, financial risks that go along with that. There are certainly other business impacts as well. And one interesting statistic that I just wanted to call to your attention in case you haven't seen it. In December, the OECD released a report, the Bribery Report, that reviewed cases brought by OECD member countries since 1999. And there was a very interesting statistic that came from that report, and it's basically that on average, bribes equaled almost 11% of the total transaction value and 34.5% of the profits derived from the contract that involved the bribery. So from a business perspective, bribery is not an effective strategy. We see other costs to business as well. There's a lot of research that suggests that companies that pay bribes open themselves up to continued bribe demands. We see disruptions in business operations, certainly the reputational harm. You know, I've mentioned exclusion from bidding on World Bank and government contracts. We see insurance premium increases, difficulty in accessing capital. The list just sort of goes on and on, so I won't belabor that point. But it's important to point out that the risks go beyond the legal, and it's important to point out, I think, and there's not enough attention really paid to this point, that having a good compliance program really helps companies not just avoid the parade of horribles that I've just described, but really to take advantage of opportunities. We see, you know, lots of opportunities in very challenging markets around the globe, and having a good compliance program in place helps companies take advantage of those opportunities. So as I said, we'll talk for just a few brief moments about the legal framework in place. I'm going to assume that a lot of you understand the legal framework, but for those of you for whom this may be new, here's a little bit. Almost every country around the globe has prohibited bribery and other forms of corruption in their domestic laws. Many have done so through adoption and implementation of international legal treaties, such as the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, also the UN Convention Against Corruption. That instrument, in fact, has been ratified, I think, by 175 countries. I usually say more than 170, but I looked again yesterday, and I think the most recent statistic is 175, which is really extraordinary. Two laws with the broadest extraterritorial reach and therefore of significance for companies really working anywhere are the U.S. Fcpa and the UK Bribery Act. They both apply outside their home countries. We see the U.S. authorities regularly applying the Fcpa both to U.S. and foreign companies for paying bribes almost anywhere in the world. And the UK Bribery Act's corporate offense has jurisdictional elements that are arguably even broader, so it really reaches a really broad swath of conduct. Because of the globalization of anti-corruption, companies with international operations are also more likely now to face criminal and regulatory investigations on multiple fronts. So you could see an investigation in the United States running parallel with an investigation in Germany. We very regularly now see prosecutors and regulators from different countries working together. And a good example of that right now is, of course, the Embraer case, which began as a 4-year investigation in the United States by the Department of Justice and the SEC. After 4 years, the U.S. turned over the case to the Brazilian authorities, who are now actively pursuing Embraer, and the United States action goes on as well. So this is really the new normal for companies today that you have to be aware of. Some common features of these laws. I mentioned before extraterritoriality, that is application outside the borders of the country enacting the law. Most include both criminal and civil offenses, not all, but most. All of the major anti-bribery laws cover bribery of a foreign government official, but the UK Bribery Act and the Brazil Clean Company Act cover domestic and commercial bribery as well, that is company-to-company bribery as well. All of the laws prohibit paying bribes through third parties working on a company's behalf or benefit, hence the need for third-party due diligence, which will be our main focus for today. And they apply both to companies and to individuals. And we see individuals facing significant jail time for violations. Just a little bit quickly on the enforcement landscape. As I mentioned earlier, the U.S. is very vigorously enforcing the Fcpa, and here are just a couple of the cases that came just from last year. So we see, countries involved in the cases sort of all over, again, sort of illustrating the extraterritorial nature of the Fcpa. We see both U.S. and foreign companies on this list, and really very significant fines in place. And in most instances, well over $100 million, which does seem to be the norm. And here are just a few examples also of foreign enforcement, and you see here again governments and the multilateral development banks. And again, very significant penalties involved in these cases. So the key takeaways just from this little bit, we do expect to see continued aggressive enforcement in the United States and elsewhere. We expect to see a continued focus on companies, but certainly in the United States, a continued focus on individuals as well. Again, cross-border cooperation and enforcement in multiple jurisdictions. And then, real scrutiny of company compliance programs. And in that regard, one of the things that the enforcement authorities are looking at is the type of due diligence that companies do on their third parties. Every company doing business with agents or any other kind of intermediary needs to have a robust, multidimensional anti-bribery compliance program in place that includes effective third-party due diligence. And so what we're going to talk about today is really how do you get started with that. We'll talk a little bit about how to define third parties, which ones you need to investigate, and to what degree. And sort of as a common theme or an overarching goal to think about as we discuss this really is how do you develop a roadmap for due diligence that won't mire your company in a costly bureaucracy, but will provide you with a consistent, credible, and repeatable process that will help you form an evidence-based view on whether to proceed with a relationship or continue one that's already in place. So that's going to be what we're going to talk about next. So who are third parties? They come in many forms. I've listed a variety of types of third parties here: agents, consultants, distributors, resellers, so on. Depending upon your industry, your business model, your size, and other factors, getting a handle on just who your third parties are can be a really difficult task. We've worked with some companies, for example, that don't have a formal mechanism for even tracking who they're working with. So we might go in and talk to someone in sales who gives us a list of certain third parties. We talk to someone else in another business unit. They may give us another list. So really the first step for companies is to get a handle on who all of your third parties are. And I mention that because I'm always surprised that is one of the sort of threshold issues that companies have to grapple with. We know from our own work with companies that the numbers range really significantly. We work with companies that have a few dozen resellers. Small startup companies may have a few dozen resellers that they're working with. We worked with large multinationals who have tens of thousands of sales and distribution agents. But for purposes of this discussion, we really should focus on the fact that almost any of your business partners can potentially create legal liability for the company. This slide illustrates sort of a typical due diligence workflow, but it's important to acknowledge right here at the outset that there really is no one right way to perform due diligence. Again, depending upon your industry, your size, the types of third parties you work with. You're going to want to tailor this, but this is a typical workflow, so we'll use this sort of as a model today. And also we can say that we know from at least in the U.S., the DOJ and the SEC have made clear that they're looking for a consistent, thoughtful, risk-based, very important, and well-documented approach. And if you want to see what the DOJ and the SEC have said about due diligence, I would commend to you the recently released Fcpa guide. You could look at some of the settlement agreements, the deferred prosecution agreements that they have entered into with companies. You could also see some opinion releases on the Department of Justice website that are very instructive on this issue. So if you want to look for what at least the U.S. enforcement authorities have said, those are some really good sources. So to develop that kind of a process for your own company, you want to think about building the framework and the workflow around your people, your processes, and your technology. Sort of levering the processes that you already have in place to create efficiencies. It's important to task the right people with clearly defined roles and responsibilities before you get started. That's incredibly important. But I guess in terms of sort of generally recognized best practices, the first step is to carry out a risk assessment of your company and of the third parties that you use. This is sort of getting at this concept of a risk-based approach. So you want to ask yourselves, are you a large, high-risk company? Are you a small, lower-risk company? What sectors are you in? Are you working with governments? Are they among your clients? Are you highly regulated? What countries are you in? How long have you worked there? Have you been there before? Are you entering a new market? Are you represented by sales agents, which create a very high risk? Do you already have strong third-party relationships in place? If you are in markets that you've been in for a while, maybe you have strong relationships in place. You know a little bit more about your partners. Our cash payments sometimes are often a part of your business. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it does highlight the kinds of questions you should be asking yourself when you're doing your risk assessment. And so the answers to each of these questions may dictate a different kind of due diligence strategy, but it will certainly help you group your third parties into tiers, high risk, medium risk, low risk. Some companies use, red, yellow, green, but it's important to, use that information from the risk assessment to group your third parties into tiers so you can focus your efforts on those that present the most risk. Second here, I've got a box in gray, consult local or in-house counsel. I think it's just important to recognize that there are limitations on the amount or type of information that you can gather about third parties in certain locations, so China certainly being one of them. So I think also from the beginning, when you are creating the process, creating this workflow, it's important to get advice of your in-house counsel, go to local counsel. Just make sure you're not going to run afoul of any laws, data privacy laws, for example, when you're collecting information about your third parties. So once you sort of, you've done the risk assessment, you've talked to local counsel, the next stage, is to start gathering that information using the tiered approach that I just mentioned. And we're going to talk about that in depth in a minute, but I just want to kind of get through this workflow first. In terms of the gathering of information, for many companies, I think it does make sense to have the business unit that works with a particular third party have some ownership of that process, but you certainly need senior management involvement. Having an intern do a Google search on a company is not diligence, and it's probably not due. It's not enough. So you want to have clear management involvement. They need to agree to the strategy. They need to allocate the proper resources, and they need to ensure that someone is reviewing the results, and we'll talk about that as we go through too. And ideally, you'll have legal and compliance involved. We work with some companies in markets that don't have in-house legal, for example, But if you do, you'll want to have your legal and compliance folks involved in the development of the strategy, for sure. Once you've gathered the information, you'll need to validate it, particularly if you're using questionnaires. If you're having your third parties, give you answers themselves, you'll need to dig a little deeper and make sure you validated that information. And of course, if you get negative, sort of red flags on third parties as well, you'll need to dig a little bit deeper, and we'll go into that into some detail. Just a note on red flags here. They're not necessarily a death knell for a relationship, but they do signify that there are other issues to assess and more questions that you should ask and have answered. Of course, if a red flag is serious enough, or you can't get enough information to make yourself comfortable, you may have to be ready to walk away from a relationship. But it's important to note that red flags can be resolved, and so we'll talk about that as we go forward. So next, I think, is ensuring that you're documenting the process. We'll talk about that too. And then assuming you get comfortable and you have the necessary approvals, you'll want to look at ensuring that you keep your due diligence up to date. So that's sort of a typical workflow that I think you could use and adapt as you're thinking about your own company. So what about this tiered approach, and what do you really need to know about the third parties that you're working with? At the threshold, I think it's important to understand why you're engaging the third party in the first place. So that is having a clear rationale or business justification for using the third party. You certainly need to understand its qualifications, its business relationships, reputation, and any relationships that it may have with government. And then beyond that, you need to dig deep enough to uncover areas of risk to you and then create a record to protect you if a problem later arises. So that's sort of those are the basics of this tiered approach. So level one, for any company that you're going to work with, you likely already have some information. You may have documents that you have requested. You probably know something about the company itself, names of important contacts, address, company registration information, so on. You may have some other data that you have gathered from public sources. As a first step, it's important to know what you already have on hand. So look at that before you begin additional searches. Also here, it's important to understand how you found the third party in the first place. If it was recommended to you by a government official, for example, that is a big red flag. So understanding where the third party came from is quite important. Then at this first level, you want to look certainly at public sources of data. Search the internet. Look at their website. Look at other websites. You can look at business journals. There are industry publications. Certainly you'll want to have a Dun & Bradstreet report. But you're looking for any indications of reputational issues, links to prior bribery certainly, but also links to things like fraud, other crimes, terrorism, abuses of human rights, anything that really gives you pause about this company. And I think it's important here to note, too, that, we're talking about anti-corruption due diligence, but when you're doing this, you should sort of look a little broader at these other issues that I've mentioned that also create legal risk for the company. Very important is to check whether the company appears on any sanctions lists. Have they been debarred? Are they a restricted party? Most countries and several international organizations keep such lists, but the easiest thing to do, and what I think is best practice, and I would certainly recommend, is going to an outside list aggregator. There are many who do this. Without endorsing any, I'll mention a few. I think Dow Jones Risk and Compliance does this. Regulatory Data Corp does this. But going to a reputable list aggregator is probably the best and easiest way to ensure that you're getting the broadest view possible of these blacklists. And that, again, is also really important. Checking its PEPs list, politically exposed persons. This will let you see if the third party or their family member is or has recently been a government official. That's very important. And those PEPs lists would be included in these outside list aggregator databases as well. And so, that's sort of a good start at due diligence. If you've got a party who you think is presenting, sort of more than a low risk of bribery, you'll want to go on to a second tier where you may want to use a more in-depth questionnaire. Probably engage in some interviews with the third party, and you can do this by phone. You'll check references. You should probably do a closer review of court records, again, looking for any indications of prior bad acts. At this point, I think, you want to look at the company's financial records, validate those, and maybe do a deeper dive into some of the public records, focusing on court filings. In terms of your media searches, you may want to look at country level, sort of local language media. And so, all of this requires just, more in terms of time and resources on your part to do this kind of due diligence. But when you've got, more than a low risk, you want to do this kind of deeper dive. Level 3 is the true deep dive. And here I think when you've got a high-risk company, in addition to doing all of the things that we've talked about before, this is where you'll want to do on-site inspections. You'll want to do in-person interviews. That may include interviews of business associates of the company, certainly the company itself, but you probably want to cast a wider net here. You may want to talk to other local sources. Some companies will go to the U.S. Embassy in country, talk to the U.S. Commercial Service there. There are some resources that you can use. There are local Transparency International chapters that I know some of the companies that we've worked with have gone to in the past. You're really looking at all of the sources that are available to you. You can certainly carry these kinds of interviews out yourself, but this may be where you also want to hire a third party who is really expert in providing these services in this area. So let's talk for a minute. You've done the due diligence. You've used the tiered approach. Let's talk for a minute about what to do when and if you find red flags. I've listed some common red flags here. I should also say that finding no information on a person or a company can also be a red flag. If you can't get any information, nobody can tell you about the company, there are no references, that should be sending off alarm bells in your mind. But, as I said before, a red flag is not necessarily the kiss of death. Certainly if you find one, you'll want to go to the next level of diligence. So if you've done the Tier 1 and you see something that makes you uncomfortable, you're going to want to go to Tier 2. And if you can't get comfortable there, you want to go all the way to Tier 3 and do the full due diligence that we discussed, including, getting experts involved and getting your own in-house legal or outside counsel involved. But, many flags can be addressed and cleared through a variety of means. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, what do you do when you find these things? There are a couple of strategies that you can employ. Certainly, you can ask for additional representations and warranties, and sort of, going beyond the standard of just, a company agrees that they haven't been involved in and will not be involved in, bribery and corruption. You may want to get representations about ownership. If that's something that's concerning you, you may want to get representations about no pending or past investigations. That sort of thinking along those lines of how can you creatively use your contracts to protect you. In the contract itself, you can address these issues. You might use a modified scope of work. You might want to make sure you've got audit rights. You may want to absolutely restrict interactions with government officials. Thinking about how can you use your contracts. If you're concerned, you may require more detailed invoices from companies. You can also do things like train, capacity build. You can do more frequent monitoring if you've got a company that gives you some pause. We've worked with some companies that send very regular compliance reminders and that ask for more frequent certification. So instead of sort of an annual certification, you might do it on a 6-month basis. We've worked with companies also that will update their due diligence, more often. So again, maybe instead of an annual basis, you do it on a 4 to 6 month basis. And then finally, you can do a very serious review of their own compliance program, which is, very important to ensure that they actually have the capacity to live up to the representations and warranties that you're trying to get from them. Of course, there are some very serious red flags that you may never be able to clear, and if that's the case, you certainly have to walk away. But, hopefully that doesn't happen too often. I think the most important thing is, again, having this process in place, following it, and documenting it, and not making too many exceptions, And if you do, having a good reason for that and documenting that. So, that I think can't be stressed enough. If you want your process to protect you in the end if a problem does arise, you have to have been sure that you've documented it properly. So that's that's an overview of the process. I think, again, to remember it should be risk-based. You certainly want to focus on government ownership and touch points. And you want to act consistently and reasonably as you're going through the process. Now, I wanted to talk for a minute about actually that last point that I raised about assessing your third party's compliance program. For any company that presents, again, more than a low risk of bribery, one of the things that you want to make sure of is that that company actually has the capacity to address its own corruption risks internally and also with third parties. So I wanted to talk just for a minute about what effective compliance looks like. With the companies that we've worked with, we have developed a framework that we used when we go in and assess what their compliance programs look like, how mature they are, and then how to improve them. And so I just threw this up here on this slide. We've got a 7 process category approach. You might see 10 categories or 8, but this is based on internationally recognized good practice in the anti-corruption area. And if you want to know a little bit more about compliance programs, there are lots of sources that you can go to. Certainly the Fcpa guide that the DOJ and the SEC released, and I mentioned earlier, it's a good place to look if you want to know more about what the Justice Department and the SEC expect in terms of due diligence, but also just in terms of compliance programs generally. That's a very good source. But there are others. The OECD has released a good practice guidance. There are some model codes that you could turn to. Transparency International has the Transparency International Business Principles for Countering Bribery. The World Economic Forum has an initiative called Partnering Against Corruption, PACI, that has a set of principles very similar to the TI business principles. There are a lot of places that you can look. Our framework is based on all of those guidelines. And so this is what it is. And I think when you are thinking about your third parties, these are the areas in which you want to look. You want to make sure that they themselves have an anti-corruption policy and some procedures for companies, for their employees to follow. You want to make sure that somebody in that company has responsibility for anti-corruption compliance, and that person is of enough seniority to really have the credibility within the company to ensure that corruption is being taken seriously and that it's being addressed seriously. You want to make sure that the company actually understands its own risks. So you're doing a risk assessment of your company. You're doing a risk assessment of your third parties. You want to make sure that that third party in turn understands its own risks and where they lie. And to the extent that you can, and this can be difficult sometimes, but you want to make sure that your third party is managing its own supply chain very well. So, in an ideal world, you would want to push your due diligence requirements through to your third parties so that they in turn are doing due diligence on their third parties. Because, you can find yourself in a situation where you're working with a company, they're using subcontractors, and that's just cascading your liability down through supply chain. So you want to make sure that the third party itself is doing some kind of due diligence on the subcontractors that it's using on your project so they're not creating more risk for you. And that can be difficult. I know that you have a lot less control over third parties than you do of your own employees, but if it's possible to do that, that's certainly a best practice. In terms of training and capacity building, you can certainly train your own third parties, but you want to make sure that they're training their employees and their third parties if they can. You want to make sure that they're also monitoring inside the company, just like you monitor your company. You want to make sure they're monitoring to ensure that if something is happening, if a problem's arising, they are catching it quickly, they're addressing it, and hopefully nipping it in the bud. And then finally, when problems do arise, you want to make sure that they're addressing them, addressing the problem itself, but then also filling the gap so that those kind of problems don't arise again. And I think, certainly with your third parties, this is a really important piece of your due diligence, just making sure that you understand what processes these companies have in place, whether they have the capacity to live up to the representations and warranties that you're diligently putting in your contracts with them, and whether they really are doing what they can to ensure they're addressing corruption risk so it doesn't flow back up to you. So just a little bit more about us, what we do, and what I would recommend any company doing is so putting your third parties through this kind of a program. We start with a self-assessment, and companies can do that. It helps them get started and sort of get educated. It helps them pull the right people together to sort of do their own sort of insightful look at the program to see where they think they are. But the most important piece really is having an independent evaluation. This is where you get somebody to go in and take a good look and give the company sort of an independent view of how the program is designed and how it's working. And a review of key documents is important. We certainly do that when we're working with companies. And then, to the extent you can, then helping those companies improve. And that's the third sort of leg of our service when we're working with companies. The first piece is the measurement is important, but this improvement piece is really the heart of it. And you can do that through a variety of methods and means. Sometimes all it takes is more training, which I've mentioned before. And, you can use online resources. There's lots of good training out there. We provide training. You can do informal sort of workshops. company talks, brown bag lunches, they don't have to always be incredibly formal processes, but the idea is when you see a gap in your third party's program, that you help them fill it in some way, or you send them to other resources that would help them fill it in some way. So that's sort of the kind of program that we put in place at CREATE. And if anybody wants additional information about it, please just send me an email. I'm happy to talk to you about what we do. But regardless of our service, this is just as a sort of a process. This is a great way to ensure that your third parties can really address corruption so that they're not creating more risk for you. So that's sort of the end of the presentation today. If you have any questions now, I'd be very happy to answer them. You can use the chat function on the web portal, or if you'd prefer, you can send me an email and I will answer it. Let me put my email up here on screen. There I am. I'm Leslie Benton. So you can send me a personal email and I would be happy to answer it. We will also make these slides available to you after the webinar, so we'll send those to you. And if there aren't any questions, I don't see any. Just want to thank you very much for being with us today. Oh, actually, I do see a question. If you feel your third party falls short, how far can you go in terms of helping them without giving legal advice and or telling them exactly what they need to do? Can you give more examples of what you can do without crossing the line? Yes. One of the things that you can, one of the most important things that you can do is sort of put your third party in touch with someone who can provide the kind of review that I've described here. We do it, others do it. Many companies like to use outside third parties because it does sort of obviate this issue of the company providing legal advice or getting too closely involved with your third party. Some companies are concerned about creating an employee-employer relationship. So I definitely understand the need for some sort of separation between you and your third party. So there are lots of sources out there for companies. We have a manual that companies can use. But, again, that DOJ guidance is very good. There are lots of training programs. Some you can find online for free. Others are, do have some cost associated with them. But there are a number of NGOs. I know Transparency International has resources. We have resources. The World Economic Forum Partnering Against Corruption Initiative has resources for companies. So those are some ways that you can sort of train and capacity build and give advice. And then I think it's important to go back to some of the other things that I said about what you can do as a company just in terms of requirements for your third parties. So make sure your contracts are really good. Make sure that you're getting very frequent updates on your due diligence. Make sure that you're getting certifications from the third parties on a very regular basis. Those are all things that you can do, I think, to address the issue if you think a third party is falling short. So thank you. That was a really good question. I don't see any others now, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. But again, thank you very much for being with us today, and we hope you'll join other CREATE webinars in the future. Thank you.